There's no such thing as overtraining, as under recovering, et cetera, until it actually reaches a critical juncture where you know that your guys are overreaching. And maybe you're intentionally pushing them to that point, or maybe it just happens because they're not recovering fast enough. My point being is we should at least have awareness of what a systematic or a planned drop in some sort of volume, intensity, or frequency can do for the athlete in super compensating and peaking for performance. So there's a there's a framing. It's a classified as a reload, classified as a peak. But at a certain point, if you do have a drop in volume, and I'll go through how I strategize it with Gen Pop and just this more organic, like seamlessly introduced into it by undulating periodization. But I do think it's worth at least visiting the idea. Before I get into deload, I think we need to understand everything is moving forward in terms of progressive overload. It's the rate and quantity of adaptation, right? So if I can go up in intensity or volume or density from one week to the next, I'm adapting to something, right? Whether that's just a building a muscle tissue, better nervous system function, doesn't really matter right now what the reason why that adaptation occurs. But if I'm able to make some sort of progression in one of those three variables, I've adapted to something. And those break up in intensity. So I'm either increasing external load or velocity and peak force, which has become more and more important to me with things like a flywheel or isoinertial work. If we look at volume, we can increase reps, we can increase time under tension, we can increase sets. Remember sets, because that's going to have the biggest impact overall tonnage. So if I remove 1 rep versus I remove 8 reps is going to have a much bigger systemic impact. So if we're thinking about a drop in volume from a Mujica-based tapering strategy of 50 to 60% drop in total volume, you're probably thinking cutting sets, which is going to go into duration or density in a big part. So if I look at, I'm still going to do an hour session, I'm just going to do it in a way dense manner. You have a double, I guess, regression looking at volume and density. But the other part is maybe you should cut the session duration down by half, or maybe you fill it with other like recovery modalities. But when we look at the progressive overload, this is what we're fighting for every single week. And it's the foundation of what we do. So having an ability to plan a systematic back off is a huge part. And what are we trying to avoid? It's the other principle. And this is classified in NSCA as diminishing returns, and Poliquin is critical drop off, which I have a graphic to show you on that. But it's superseding the rate of adaptation from one microcycle to the next. And we have a couple contingencies when we hit diminishing returns. I can drop intensity or reduce external load. I can reduce number of sets. I don't like the idea of reducing reps because usually we have to pick a lane from a single progression standpoint. So I'm going to do stage ascending 5-5, 7-7, 9-9 for 3 to 4 weeks. And if I go all of a sudden now I'm going to do a 1-1, 3-3, 5-5, I'm essentially doing a different stimulus altogether. And I might have went from an accumulation-like focus to an intensification, and we are essentially starting a new mesocycle. So when we think about changing the rep scheme, I would say a much better strategy is reduce the sets to stay within that quality that you're trying to develop, whether it's hypertrophy or muscular endurance or relative strength or functional hypertrophy. And then we look at density, we can increase rest, which if I'm increasing the rest, whether it's an expanding or compressing type of fashion, no matter what, we're so systematically deloading them, and we have to respond to that lack there of adaptation. But the goal of a deload is to prevent diminishing returns. So if I'm thinking about it, we're training our ass off, we're going 8 weeks through a summer program, or I have a client that's with me for 3 months. I'm trying to have constant growth from one thing to the next to preserve intensity throughout the entire training cycle. Because intensity, and that's relatively speaking to the rep that we're using, we're thinking 100% rep max type of intensity, whether it's 5 reps or 10 reps or 20 reps. It's, can I preserve that as long as possible? And having a systematic reduction in something to maintain that intensity throughout the entire macro cycle. Training residuals, which is going to be a big part to think about, is if I'm going to drop anything, whether it's intensity, volume, or density, what is going to be the residual if I have a drop or stop training altogether? So we look at cardiovascular deadaptations. We're looking at a change or potential of VO2 max. And the window of that, which I'll go through Iserin's block periodization, which I'm just going back through this, is, man, I've been so influenced by this stuff, and having a profound level of thought towards programming is to stay true to these principles. But when I look at a drop in cardiovascular adaptation, we have a pretty large window before a VO2 max reduction starts to occur, like a 30 days, like plus or minus 5. So maybe not a huge thing. Plus, we're going to stay active, and I'll talk about how we want to maintain frequency to maintain that plan. Because once you get momentum, hey, you're going to come Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 a.m. I'm not getting any client or athlete off that schedule, no matter what. And I want to keep them on that, whether it's a financial decision or they built their schedule around this. I'm not messing with frequency. So my only other contingency would be changing total volume, which is, from a research perspective, massively important. Metabolic deadaptation, so we can look at some sort of change in vascular health and cardiovascular health and respiratory health and leading into some. But these are, you see this typically over 4 weeks, which I talked about before, is like a 30-day window, which you start to see changes. Muscle loss is the big one. And one of the things about deloading in terms of volume is you see glycogen supercompensation, and we do see a short-term spike in muscle mass from a drop in total volume through sets. And again, this is off the caveat, we're training our ass off, we're pushing people to an overreach state. You're going to see that. But over time, if we're going to stop training altogether, which is a reason why we need to consider maintaining frequency, is we'll see a drop in muscle mass if we stop training over a course of 2 to 3 weeks. And then neuromuscular adaptation, use it or lose it. We lose the ability to produce force, power, velocity if we don't train at a certain level of cadence, at least with the intent behind what we're trying to do with the set and rep scheme. This is from Isserin. So the window of 30 days for oxidative and strength, the faster it is, the faster the faster the residual loss. The slower it is, the longer the residual loss, which gives you some windows. If you're thinking about maintaining aerobic capacity through a preseason, and you're like, I work with a football staff that's does strength training, we're going to maintain oxidative capacity longer. You need to get on a table and say, we need to do something heavy or fast in the weight room to preserve this quality that I developed at such a level in the off season. And from a tapering perspective, if you're working with cyclical activities like swimming or cycling, they're going to start getting anxious and nervous about they're not going to be recovered going into that marathon or that 1600 meter or that swim event. And you're going to have to say, okay, I'm not going to crush you. I'm just going to drop volume in the weight room, and you're going to give me one good effort, and we're going to maintain these alactic qualities that we work so hard to develop, but we have to have exposure there. I'm building up 2 cases here that, like, we're going to have to eventually pay the price for hard training, but then we also need to get out in front of the, why don't I just do nothing? Plan deload. So we're thinking about indicators now. It's either prior to competition or preseason. So we're thinking about it. Like, I know when they need to peak, so I'm going to start to taper or start to back off in some way. And that's already understood. Organic. We start to see critical drop off. So their sets are no longer what we want, whether they can't maintain position, range of motion, they can't hit their reps, or they get off a rep bracket, they start to get outside the velocity brackets. That's the point of diminished returns. I got a cool graphic to show you guys after that. Poor autonomic nervous system function. This is usually lifestyle related, not training related. So you start to see elevated resting heart rate, depressed HRV, elongated heart rate recovery, elevated blood pressure. You'll see this a lot more during intensification blocks, which is, you have less latitude, in my opinion, that we see disruption from the autonomic nervous system function much more rapidly if their lifestyle is not in check during intensification blocks. And then we look at during more mixed method or conjugate, the acute chronic loads become more and more valuable. So if I look at it from, okay, a normal RPE is a 6 for a 60-minute session, that's 360 arbitrary units. That's our rolling average. And all of a sudden I get up to an 8 for 3 sessions in a row. That's going to be a pretty significant spike in acute load. When it starts to get acute spikes multiple weeks in a row, we start to see a potential need to do some sort of deload. And that could be easily from a lifestyle and nutritional perspective, or it could be just we're training really hard. Like, you do 3 weeks of German volume training, you're going to start to see people break down. And in a private sector, they'll just stop showing up. In a public sector, they're going to start really struggling to hit their sets and reps, at least at the intensities we want to maintain. So if you think about that, you have to start to get out in front of that. But I see this a lot with more of a mixed method. So I'm going to work high rate of force development, high force, and then high work. You're going to start to see these things have a bleed over effect from one to the next. And it's going to be hard to just start dissect where that actual drop in performance is. It just probably means their acute load is probably getting too high and they're not recovering well enough, and you've been tapping the well too often. Time to start thinking about deload. In terms of critical drop off, this is from Poliquin. If we think about I'm working relative strength, we got about a 7% window. And the way I like to think about this is we all have shitty days or we all lose focus on certain sets. And you have to give what I call a mulligan. And why I like rep brackets is chances are there's outside influence, environmental constraints, factors that are out of our control. And if you go, hey, that one rep was just a lack of focus, it doesn't count towards critical drop off, but you're still within the rep bracket. It's okay. We're going to stay at the same intensity. But let's say that's multiple sets in a row. Now we have some sort of pattern that they're probably hit a diminishing returns point, and that window is different based off of relative strength all the way from muscular endurance. But I think that bandwidth, the longer it goes or the slower it is, the bigger the bandwidth you need to give. So you can see in terms of acceptable drop, 7 to 20%, it really breaks down to either a rep bracket or time under tension. So if you ever look at my programs, when I'm working relative strength, it's about a 1 to 2 rep bracket. So you can see this kind of window from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. But then we start getting a little longer, it gets to a 2 rep, a 3 rep, a 4 rep, and then all the way down here, a 5 rep. If you have multiple sets where they're not performing, and chances are if you're doing muscular endurance, you're probably doing 2, 3 sets of that rep bracket, you should probably really consider the fact that you've been past the point of a deload. Whether if it's an overreaching, great, you did your job, you pushed them to that really massive juncture. But if they are way out of that bracket, unplanned state, like it's just too early, you have to really start thinking about a deload. I heard we're off of mute right now. Anyone have any questions or anything they want to chime in on? All right, I'll keep rolling. So I got all these notes. I'll spare you guys from reading this, but Majika is the world's leading authority on tapering. Got a great book on it. Thank God for AI. You can pump this into AI. Majika's deload strategy, 50 to 60% there. And I highlighted a bunch of stuff, so you guys can see that here. 40 to 60% volume drop from high training week. It refills glycogen stores. And then we look at it from a 10 to 14 day period, right? You shouldn't be going over 2 weeks in terms of any taper, but from a deload is typically 1 microcycle. And we'll talk a little bit about that. There's 2 tapers that you can do. You can do a step taper, which employs a reduction in training immediately, and this reduction is then maintained for the rest of the taper period, or a progressive taper, which is a successive reduction in training. So imagine that I get here and I'm doing a slow gradual decline, or, which is a progressive, or I get here and I drop massively. Where you see a step taper come out is just going to be probably more of a drop in frequency. And this is, in my opinion, probably more high performance environments with cyclical individual like Olympic sports. That, hey, I'm going to start cutting back on sessions. We're going to slowly start to gradually, or we're going to violently drop total volume through dropping of frequency. So if I start to break down in terms of that direction, I want to be conscious of the fact that we got someone, I'm going to use someone here. Is that me? No, it's Sam. Sam, put yourself on mute, please. If we go to that, like employing some sort of, I'm working with an Olympic athlete, back off in a very successive manner, or if I'm working with a general population client or a team sector, probably need to think about a progressive manner. Majika talks about it, but a meta-analysis found the progressive taper is slightly more effective than for single-day events. However, cycling stages and step taper, his stuff is all basically working with cyclists and swimmers. So there's definitely a bias there. All right, so strategies. Volume reduction, 40 to 60%. In my strategy, but just reducing sets. So if I'm going to do, let's say 8 sets of 6, I'm going to drop it down potentially to 4, maybe even 3 sets. Intensity. I don't think we should be thinking about dropping intensity. With the drop in volume, it becomes a psychological trick to stay at the same intensity, if not maybe go up, if you potentially can. But you know that you're telling them it's going to be half the total volume. So give me what you got. Let's get what we need and let's get out. Duration, again, it's going to be coming down to we're doing less total sets. So I can go more rest, which is going to impact density. Probably better. I got them in there. We're going to do some other modality stuff, or we're going to do elongated warm-up or a lot more post-work stuff. But duration is going to change from that like meat and potatoes of your workout, spending under high level resistance or going at a high intensity just from the volume drop. And then frequency, maintain momentum at all costs. You got them in 3 times a week. Don't lose those sessions and don't get them off their rhythm if you're a team sport athlete. If we look at it from a physiological spec, there's a psychological component to it here as well. That training monotony is real. And if we look at monotony scores, a lot of this is just doing the same patterns to threshold redundantly. And that leads into a very monotonous type of effect. And the psychological aspect of monotony is pretty taxing. So if you have a systematic drop and it's novel, and they can recover and super compensate by increasing their glycogen stores, then we're going to have some pretty big impacts on their performance. We can game it. Now, we're timing this. And a lot of times athletes psychologically actually feel worse during deload weeks. And you have to condition them to go, this is part of the process. We're just trying to make you feel good when it matters. So we're going into that first practice of preseason, or we're going to that first lift in your meet. You need to be as prepared from a psychological perspective. And the deload week is now representative of how you've been overreaching for a period of time. This is now playing out the way you feel during training, and you manage that psychological aspect when you do a deload, and it's all about framing. Sherman and colleagues showed that well-trained runners supercompensate by increasing glycogen store 3 days of a taper, right? Just a 3-day period shows a supercompensation in glycogen. And why glycogen is important, it's cross-sectional muscle area. Anytime you see glycogen supercompensate, you see increase in cross-sectional muscle area, whether it's this cross-sectional muscle area fascicle or medium or the myosin heavy chains, you start to see this. So from a type 1 muscle fiber to a type 2, you see a increase in cross-sectional muscle area, which you start to fill up. What I would say from a nutritional component during a deload, you don't want to mess with any kind of caloric and macronutrient. You want to maintain that. If not, maybe potentially super compensate with more carbohydrates during this period, but that's a separate conversation. So the way I structure this with a group or a team is I know my meso, and I know that I'm going to have some sort of change from a macro perspective from one meso to the second. So we can look in the middle here. This is an undulating type of process here. So I'm looking from a general increase in progressive overload from the first session to the last session of that microcycle, going up about 10 to 15%. And then I'm going to have some sort of change where I'm going to go to intensification, and I want to keep that under 15 total percent typically. But for more gen, pop, NARP level things or intermediate novice level trainees, you want to keep that gross change from an accumulation block to intensification block probably under 10%. And you can see here for more novice, a longer meso, 5% change, and you see more advanced, you're going to have just more rapid changes. And way I think about introducing deload weeks, in this case, I'm probably going to have a meso of a 10 to 14 day period of a pretty significant drop in volume. And I might play that with, hey, we're going to start to spike in terms of running or doing speed, agility, quickness. I'm going to have a drop in volume in the weight room so I can allow those guys to react to that novel stimulus of sprinting more, changing direction more. But for most part, in the middle of the road where most people live and play is 4-week mesos. And then I'm using this week 1 as a deload strategy. And Joe Ken refers to it as a base week. You can call it a technique week. But no matter what, you'll see people report muscle soreness and fatigue with very low intensity. That's where I think it plays out. And I know that kind of feels like counter to the idea of a drop in volume, but this isn't high performance here. This is just trying to prevent diminishing returns. So I constantly can go up every 4-week increments and have this rate of change of 10% every single time I go to an accumulation block to intensification block or vice versa. Versus high performance, it's, hey, I'm going to drop volume here and I'm going to start to increase other things or prioritize other things. I'm going to start to ramp back up, and then I'll probably deload here again. Now, in terms of a advanced level person, the Joe Ken performance cycle. So if you're going to stick with a 4-week mesocycle, you'll see a pretty significant change from maybe intensity. You can toggle with the volume here. And what I'm trying to do is paint a picture of, in a team sector, in a private sector, in a one-on-one or a group sector, is you got to be really creative of doing this stuff because you're managing so many different dynamics psychologically. And if someone's paying for a session and they're doing half the work, they're going to feel like they're getting less value. If you're in a team environment and everyone's adapting at different rates, you have to have a built-in excuse to deload or back off in some way. And my whole thing is you're probably going to feel soreness and fatigue from doing the novel thing that we're doing right now. It's natural to have this drop in volume or intensity going from one mesocycle to the next. And the way this really plays out from an adaptation rate is I'm going into this, now I'm depleting, whether this is neuromuscular, glycogen depletion, and then a supercompensation, and then I'm just building out through there from there. All right, now I'm going to pause on that one because I know there's probably some questions on this. I got all the slides here, and I'll share this on the collective membership page, but want to take some questions here, and anyone have any strategies on their end that they've been utilizing, or any things that they're like, I tried to deload and I hated it, I just lost the room, or I couldn't really manage it. That means I crushed the presentation there.
In the college setting, like oftentimes like your deload is it's built in. Like you have your spring break's gonna come at this time where you're gonna push and then a part of the season's gonna change. So things are built in. But last summer, I'm trying to run the omni contraction like after working for Bishop, going to conference and stuff. I'm trying to run that with my basketball guys. But then our head coach drops the ball on me the day before summer training starts that we're going to do Benny's camp every Friday as a team because we need to do something hard. And I talked to him. I think I couldn't talk him out of it. And he was like, pay for 8 sessions up front. So I went for the whole summer and he's already wearing in Fridays. We saw training and our dudes are just falling off a cliff after like week 2. Like, should they were moving easily, they get buried by. So I had to just completely change everything I was doing from like the Omni, which is supposed to mitigate stress each day to the next and just go like, how can I do this? It was just like upper this, lower, or lower, upper, day off, total, then go get fucked by berries, boot camp Friday, just doing just stupid high impact, high intensity cardio, getting nothing out of it for college basketball. Then they go play pickup and they just burnt out like I've never seen before. And this is 18 to 20-year-old kids getting fed. That was my only like real time I've had to like deload in like that college setting where like you can control your things because it's built in with natural breaks and things like that.
Yeah, so that's a good discussion point there, because if you think about it, this is a macro approach of systematically, whether it's a progressive or step or an organic or planned, back off in volume to allow for some sort of super compensation. But then there's a micro. And if you look at vertical integration and high-low, that is essentially a structure of either high volume, low intensity, or high intensity, low volume on a particular day to facilitate a weak microcycle that allows for constant growth. Because if you just go high every day, people will burn out by day 4. And day 4 is not as quality as you want it to be. And especially if you're working these alactic or ATP PCR type of systems, that you're going to struggle to get the output that you want on the 4th day. And every day matters, especially in the team sector. So you start to titrate up volume and intensity throughout the microcycle to allow for every day to be valuable. And then you go into, all right, now we're working a mixed quality. We're just breaking up into a more concurrent like strategy by developing these things. But the micro approach of a systematic drop in volume or intensity from one day to the next is a great counter to, do we ever really need to deload if my microcycles are organized in a way to facilitate recovery within that calendar week?
I agree. And I think that as you progress and as you're going through your different stages, you can figure out, like, if you put it in the week and you were able to have a high, a low, it's probably your best bet at the end of the day. One thing that I'd like to pose to the group, going from 75% on the first week, and the first week being a technical week, to the second week to 85%. And what happens when half your team doesn't hit that? Where do you go there? Do you fall back to another starting week of beginning? You know what I'm saying? So in terms of that, I'd like to pose that.
That's caveat to that. It's not absolute intensity, that's relative intensity. So you're basically taking your training max at 75% of whatever it normally is. And then week 2 is 85%. Week 3 would be 95 or 90%. And then week 4 would be 100%. Or you can look at it as reps in reserve. And week 4 is 0 reps in reserve. Week 3 would be 1 to 2. Week 2 would be 3 to 4. And then week 1 would be 4 to 5. So you're shaving away reps in reserve as you go through that, or you can go with John Jost relative intensity. But that weekly intensity is basically taking your max on that rep scheme and multiplying it by 0.75. Now, if I have a 100-pound max, I'm working at a 75-pound max for that week. And then week 2 would be 85, and then et cetera. But with that being said, is sometimes that's hard to explain. Sometimes that's hard to get across to the group. I always just tell people, no misses week 1. 0 misses. That week 1 is not the week to push threshold. And you get to these hard reps threshold. So if we're going let's say, like, strip it down to a high intensity training where we just do 1 set to failure. Those threshold reps or those failure reps, if you're going to go ahead and every day is going to failure, you're always working 100% relative intensity or 0 reps in reserve. And that adaptation rate, which Mentor will talk extensively about, is like you need 10 days in order to fully recover from this from a neuromuscular and muscular perspective, even a cardiovascular perspective. versus I'm going to get them 3-4 sessions a week and I'm going to have to work all these different qualities. I want to have some sort of mechanism to control that threshold. But the way I explain it to a group is at week 1, no one's missing. You're getting a feel for the weight. You're going to feel sore no matter what. So just make sure we execute. We understand the set and rep scheme, the tempo, the rest, the exercise, have perfect reps. Week 2, I'm going to push you a little bit more. If it was super easy and I utilize a strategy of it's like a hybrid APRE, but if you report under a 3, you should be making a 10% jump from one week to the next. If you report between a 3 and a 4, it could be this 5-10%. And if it's above a 4, getting into this like 5-6, which the modified Borg is 6 is very hard, you might want to think about a 2.5% jump. If you report a 7 or 8, you might want to stay the same way. If you missed reps, you're going to have to stay the same way. And that you're just gaming and explaining and managing group. And you did a really crappy job of explaining it when no one gets the assignment and everyone's collectively screwing it up in the group. You got to get better at just managing that group and giving them, go to the Erickson's model. What's the goal, the task, the feedback, and then the level of challenge. In week 1 of a training block, they're going to get soreness. It's just no matter what. So you just go get your reps, no missed reps. Let's have a great day. And next week, was it super easy? Make a bigger jump. Was it moderately hard? Don't make as big of a jump. Was it hard? Okay, make a small jump. Was it really hard? Let's stay at the same weight. You missed a couple reps. You lost your range of motion. You lost your position. Let's just try to improve upon that. That's the adaptation, is doing what we're supposed to do week 1. The other point here is the elephant in the room is chances are we never have perfect laboratory-like conditions. So people miss sessions and kids show up late and they screw up our beautiful periodization scheme. These are ideal conditions that we have an athlete that's pushing and really training hard. And I think you should be optimistic with the idea that we'll eventually, if we're really good, really dedicated, type A, focused, all in type of athletes and clients will gravitate to you. And you should at least have some sort of, how am I going to manage pushing this kid or this athlete to overreach state all the time? And I know my strategy from a macro perspective or micro perspective to do with that guy. Majority of us fall into this bell curve distribution of they're going to screw up our periodization plan, just at least in your mind of I want to go more on a micro scale and manage a high-low, or maybe going into, if they're missing sessions, don't worry about deloading or backing off at all. Screw them. They need to just keep pushing and make sure that you're getting the most out of every single day.